Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Bice, and we got a great cast for you tonight. We're going to be talking to one of the designers behind the game John Wick Hex, an idea that sounds crazy on paper to take the kinetic action of the popular movie or action franchise and turn it into a kind of We Go strategy game. We are going to be talking about the design and implementation of that tonight. So please welcome from Bithell Games, Nic Tringali.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It is a pleasure to have you on, Nic. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's been a relatively calm, relaxing day in our release week, it's been good.
Yep, and for those of you listening to this right now, we are recording this on October 10th, so I think the game's been out for, has it been like 2 or 3 days?
2 days, yeah. It came out Tuesday, and today's Thursday.
Yeah, and definitely congratulations on the release of it. Yeah, man, we definitely have a lot to talk about. It's not every day where we have not only a movie tie-in game, but a movie tie-in game that just seems like a crazy combination of genres and designs. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure there's going to be a very interesting cast for sure. But to get things started, since this is your first time on, for people listening, Nic, can you talk a little bit about your background when it comes to the game industry, and then kind of give us what is John Wick Hex?
Yeah, so my background is in 3D modeling, and so that's how I sort of got my first paid jobs. But I also, in addition to doing that on a few little projects, I self-coded and worked with some collaborators and self-published a few games, and then eventually kind of started working with Mike Bithell at Bithell Games and kind of worked sort of kind of fell into doing like a lot more programming and design, and ended up to being lead programmer and a co-designer on John Wick Hex. Mm-hmm. And as a pitch for the game itself, we bill it as a like fight choreography tactics game or a timeline strategy game to kind of invent new parlance if we wanted to. And so yeah, it's essentially like the action scenes from the movie we have tried to distill down into the language of a tactics game, and to I guess to like try and get from one point to the other with that sort of set of tools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's definitely like a very interesting combination of mechanics and the loop itself. For my audience listening right now, we have definitely played and seen our fair share of strategy games, tactical games, and all like the gambit of that kind of decision making and thought process. And like John Wick definitely occupies like a very like unique area of that. So I guess my first question for you is, where did the original concept for the game come from?
Well, we definitely wanted to do a tactics game from the jump. Okay. And so when we were asked to pitch an idea to our publisher and the movie studio, we were straight away, we're like, okay, we definitely want to do a tactics game because we think that there is enough there we could explore. We didn't want to do a kind of third-person action game or first-person shooter. And so the original idea, which we made like a straight away as like a pitch prototype that Mike and I put together, was essentially like one person XCOM without a squad, and it was really bad. Like it was like if you can mentally just imagine why that would be bad, and it was bad for all of the reasons you can think of. But it got the pitch, so it definitely worked to some extent. And then there's stories that like Mike has told stories about going to the movie studio and pitching it and being told it was kind of weird. And so there was a chunk of time in between the pitch and then actually starting production. We were like, okay, let's not do turn-based. And we had this idea to do this timeline thing, or at the very least, like it wasn't originally a timeline, but it was more like, let's have this variable length actions and see where we end up with that. And so then the timeline kind of was created and developed to represent that to the player.
And going back to what you just said about kind of like the original concept for John Wick Hex and wanting to like avoid the kind of like what will be considered like the generic movie game tie-in for like that kind of franchise. Yeah. Because that's something that I think is very fascinating because and again, like my audience, I think includes a lot of older gamers, so we remember the days of old movie tie-ins and the horrors that involved in terms of those franchises. And part of the reason for that was just kind of the fact that the movie property just wasn't designed to gel with the game mechanics and the game loop. Every movie-based game that came out from like 1987 to probably like the early thousands was a 2D or 3D platformer. With John Wick Hex, as you say, you're kind of describing the original pitch as one-man XCOM and that kind of tactical strategy layer. Were there, like, as you guys are like thinking about making a game based off the property, were there any other ideas that kind of were like floating around your heads, or was this kind of tactical strategy like the first and like best like concept that you came up with?
It was, it was basically the first and only concept for sure. We knew like the size of team we wanted to work with, and obviously there are budgets involved and that sort of thing. But it was basically from the jump. We'd really never considered doing anything else, and it was going into the pitch knowing that it was going to be a very different idea probably from the rest of the field of pitches, which I have no idea what they were really, but we knew it was a risk in that sense. But for us it was like, well, this is what we want to do. If we don't get it, then we don't do this basically.
Okay. And with kind of like developing the gameplay loop itself, as you said, like with the original concept being one-man XCOM, and again, like as somebody who has lived and died many times in both the original and Firaxis's take, I can see, I'm just like running through my head right now how painful that could be when you're trying to do that. So, in terms of building the actual gameplay loop, I think we can get very meaty in the discussion at this point. Like, what was kind of like the build-up in terms of deciding, just how much I want to give the player and just how much the timeline is really the factor in everything?
Yeah, so the kind of the first immediate consequence of doing it as a one person, one actor tactics game was like, okay, so the reason we see so many tactics game use squads is because you get a chance for like combinations of moves and different expressiveness from the player in that sense with like loadouts and blah blah blah. And so the first kind of immediate problem is like, right, how do we get to that same kind of endpoint but with just one person? And it did kind of hinge on the timeline and the kind of variability of the actions. So I guess to kind of explain, for people that haven't played it, like the game is set spatially on a hex grid, and then time-wise, instead of a turn-based or a kind of like simultaneous thing like a frozen synapse, every action has a variable amount of time measured in tenths of seconds. And so moving a step is 4/10, shooting a guy is 1.3 or whatever it is. And so every action kind of is not in between that, but a slightly different amount. And so we knew from the jump, like, okay, we can get to the kind of interesting combinations of situations with this timeline, because in any given group of people or environment, the exact specifics of who's doing what when can be different, and that's how we get away from the boring one-person XCOM where really there aren't really many interesting decisions to make in one-person XCOM because you can only do quote unquote one thing, and it's only to like one target or whatever. Where when you've got a group of people and it's on a timeline, you might go, oh, okay, I know I need to stun this person first to then shoot, to then reload, to do that. And that's just like one kind of path through one situation where, eventually between, crouching and the line of sight system and so forth, like we end up giving, or hope, the idea is giving the player enough different tools so that same kind of expressiveness that you get with a squad comes through with just the single actor.
And with, again, like for people listening to us, when we're describing this kind of system of like simultaneous play along the timeline, a lot of strategy fans probably would know the colloquial, the we go system. Sometimes in tactical games, I go, you go, we each take a turn. But with something like John Wick, and the game that I think most came to my mind, which I think a lot of people listening will also probably cite, would be something like Superhot that came out a few years ago. This was a first-person shooter where time only moved when you moved. And that itself presented a very interesting take, and we can see that kind of similar decision-making with John Wick Hex. As you said, like, if you know an enemy is going to attack in, let's say, an eighth of a second, and let's say my gun will only fire at a second 30, well, then I'm going to take a shot unless I do something else to compensate.
Right. And it's funny, like I say, so I'm going to say like Superhot wasn't like a influence only in the sense that we didn't start going, all right, we're going to make Superhot tactics, but obviously, we the team played it, and it definitely is an influence in general. But it actually wasn't until we started, and I think shortly after we started production with the timeline in mind, that we're like, oh, right, like this is kind of just Superhot with a different, slightly different time and camera and that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's this very similar kind of thinking.
Yeah. And with like kind of the moves themselves, so this is again like a very major point about John Wick Hex, and again about tactical strategy games in general, is just how much do you give the player in terms of options. Like for myself, I've watched the first two John Wick movies. I haven't seen the third one yet, but anyone who's seen the movies knows just the depth of tactics that can go on display in a single action shot. You can, in like the span of 40 seconds, it goes from a gunfight to a knife fight to a fist fight, and then back to guns.
Yeah.
And when you're trying to build a game around this, it can become very difficult, because do you give the player everything? Are they the most powerful piece on the field? Or do you restrict their actions, but then in turn, does it not quite get that same feeling that you wanted out of the movies?
Yeah, so like on the actual action set, we didn't want to we basically tried to find a sweet spot of like what are like the core kind of repeating actions that the character does in the movies versus doing everything he could actually do, but then you'd get into a whole lot of like the weeds on design and production and so forth. So yeah, the set we ended up with was, or actually before I even get to that, like the idea behind them, the melee set is to really encourage movement, and so we have like a strike, which is like the only non-movement one, which is you stand and like hit someone basically, and then you have a push, which you grab them and move them with you in a straight line on this hex grid, or a takedown where they stand still and you move around them while you're attacking them and so forth. And then you have if you have a gun, you can shoot your gun or throw your gun. And so the two kind of guiding ideas for that was first to encourage a lot of movement. And so I think hopefully once people play it and you kind of get used to it, you realize like, right, while the strike and the takedown do damage and are easier to pull off, like the push becomes very useful as far as like allowing you to get behind a wall or through or behind line of sight. And the other thing is all of as far as like how powerful the player is as John, because like in the movies, of course, he just eventually obviously wins every fight, and it's always like a very cinematic struggle. But for the game, the idea was like when it's just you and one other person, it's like it's almost a non-issue. Like, and you see that in the movies, like when John is just taking down one guy, it's like not a big deal. And for him, right? And so for the player, likewise, if you can handle, just having one person is very easy to handle. And then when you add in a second person, it becomes a little bit more of a juggling act because they're always attacking. And so you're trying to space out, making sure you can pull off a melee move without being interrupted, or likewise shooting without getting shot, that sort of thing. And so as you step up the chain on like 3 or 4 or 5 people, I don't know if you've been in a fight yet with like 5 or 6 people at once, but then it's like, I mean, it's very, very, very hard to kind of get out of that. You definitely won't get out of it unscathed, but can you get out of it like reasonably well for the rest of the level? And so, yeah, it was less about, or not less about, like it was trying to evoke that feeling of the movie where like the more people that pile in, the more complex it becomes, as opposed to giving the player like a set of like RPG like tools that would increase over the course of the game, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and that's another thing, as you were just saying, in terms of making it through the level. Because that was one of the things that was kind of surprising to me, because I kind of kept myself, away from the news loop around the game. I wanted to kind of go into it blind. And the thing that kind of surprised me was that each level is essentially a set of persistently, or your stats are persistent over the course of each section in that level. So that if you end a section without any ammo in your gun, you start the next section, well, you don't have the means to shoot somebody. Yeah,
and that was very deliberate because I specifically wanted to avoid, and to some extent this kind of still stuck through, but I wanted to avoid a puzzle-like feeling to each level. So like the enemy placement is not fully static or fully random, so there's a little variability. And yeah, I did not want the feeling of like, right, I will master this exact level, and then if I get to the next one, then whether I got through the skin of my teeth or not, that doesn't matter. Like it really, it was important to like that you feel like you have to play the long game in a sense, like, I only have so many resources to bandage myself with, or guns or whatever, and try and get through a sequence of 5 of these maps in a row.
Yeah. And like when you're trying to like get through these levels, as you said, you only have limited resources to do that. And one of the things that I was thinking about while I was playing the game, and this was kind of like one of my little design quibbles, I'm sure it's something that you and the rest of the team thought of as well, was the idea of having essentially endlessly respawning enemies. Because for those of you who haven't played the game yet that are listening, as you're going through each section, the enemies can spawn in from any of the various doors. And as you said, with the enemy placements being not exactly fixed, but not exactly 100% random, it can lead to those cases where all of a sudden you're walking down a hallway and a fight between one guy turns into a fight against 4. Or my favorite point was, I think the game trolled me as I was walking towards the exit door, the guard comes right out of that door and stops me from leaving.
Yeah. I mean, also like it was challenging to try and get the player to always be moving forward, basically, because ultimately, like the maps have a goal of either get to the end or kill the boss at the end, basically, and so. Part of it was like, right, we want to kind of gently be tugging the player forward without feeling, because like if there are no enemies on screen, it does feel a little dull, and it does not feel like necessarily like a movie, which, you know, obviously is choreographed such that he's always, you know, going through people. But yeah, it was that was kind of a challenge that we fell into, and yeah, ultimately, like we, you know, with the tools we had, this is sort of where we ended up. And yeah, I suppose that's basically why it is the way it is.
And one thing that I've been seeing some people talk about with like online reviews and just some things that I was seeing, it didn't seem like there was a lot in terms of, I guess, option growth over the course of playing the game. Now, obviously, the enemies do change. You do introduce new variants in the bosses. But in terms of, I guess, giving the player more options themselves, it seems like the game is fairly self-contained. Like, your move set on the first map, if you can master that, that's going to get you through the rest of the game.
Yeah, that was deliberate because the game narratively is a prequel, but we did not want to have the idea of, oh, I am, you know, novice John Wick at the beginning of the game, and at the end of the game, I am, you know, cool, feared, bad. Like, it kind of is. It's that like isn't really, like, I understand that desire, but people want to see that. But like, it would spoil it a little from our point of view if you saw like kind of like behind the scenes. Like it is sort of the myth that like he was just born a badass. It doesn't really matter, you know, when he did it or where he came from. And so likewise, you know, narratively, that's what we wanted to do. And so if we, you know, looking at that narrative element from the design, it wouldn't really be, it would clash for one thing, but like we didn't want to have like, oh, you know, you get new powers or new moves or you know, your health increases, that sort of thing. So yeah, we did kind of keep it flattened for that reason, and relied more on like different types of environments and different combinations of enemies and that sort of thing to add some more variance. And then likewise, we have, as you progress through, you do get more, like there are essentially like passive bonuses in the form of suit upgrades that you can tweak to, you know, adjust your playing style, basically, that do increase like your health and your focus. And so we tried to kind of get back to, because yeah, obviously you do want to have like something given to you over the course of the game, but it was hard to try and keep that like he was always cool as shit narrative without then undercutting that by making you just feel more powerful over the course of the game.
Yeah, and I think that actually is a good segue into a few of the more, I guess, the IP-related questions surrounding John Wick Hex and kind of like what you guys are able to do with the property. I've spoken to developers in the past who worked with licensed IPs and some of the interesting challenges and workarounds they have to go through in terms of balancing the mechanics or the gameplay loop they have with the property itself. As you said at the start of the cast, that you pitched this idea to, I think, is it Warner Brothers, the publisher? Lionsgate, sorry. You pitched it to Lionsgate as kind of, again, like a one-man XCOM. Like, when they approved it, did they give you, again, like, this is NDA, you know, feel free to tell me, did they give you any, like, restrictions or considerations you had to deal with when designing John Wick Hex?
Well, so I have two non-answers for you. Okay. If you want. One, that I wasn't in those discussions, so I it's not even that I NDA. I not truly couldn't really tell you. But two, not really. Like they liked the idea. Like we came to them pitching, we want to make a game about the fight choreography of the movies, and you can tell. And this is evident, you know, in the production people and everyone behind the movies as well. Like you can tell that's what the movies are really kind of about. Like it's a love letter to various action movies and franchises. So they like that idea as much as we like that idea. So yeah, for my purposes and for our purposes, like they were totally into it. Like the story, Mike wrote the story, so he would be better be able to better answer that. But he, worked with or spoke with the director and read like the script of the third movie before it was released and that sort of thing. But yeah, from the beginning, it was less like, because for a film studio, like we say one man XCOM, and between you and I and game design people, we know what that means, but like that's not how we pitched it to them necessarily. It was, hey, we want to make the player feel like a fight choreographer.
Yeah. And I just wonder, like, how many of the movie executives have ever heard of Superhot or XCOM?
Exactly. Like, yeah. So it was, yeah. I mean, to some extent, a few of them had for sure. But yeah, not all of them.
In terms of the story, as we said, the game itself is considered a prequel to the movies. Like, was that like something that they put on you guys, or did you decide to turn this into a prequel as you were designing it?
I'm trying to remember. I don't fully know, but I do know we didn't want to just recreate the movie scenes. And because of that, like between the first and the second movie, I think only like a few days passes. And then the second and third movie is like minute to minute. Like it just ends and the next one just starts immediately. So it was more like, okay, well, we didn't want to really do just like the same scenes from the movies, and there wasn't really any room to play in between them. So yeah, the story kind of fell to a time before the instigating actions of the first movie.
And for people listening, just as a point of curiosity, how long was John Wick Hex in development for?
So not counting the prototype, let me oh shit. It depends on how you it depends on how you count it. Over a year, not more than it, not less than a year and a half. So kind of 14-ish months, I think. It's kind of a little bit fuzzy on both sides. So yeah, just over a year pretty much. Okay.
And with kind of the development of like the actual like process of the combat. Oh, sorry, my mind just like blanked out there. I just got my voice. Hold on 1 second. 3, 2, 1. And with like the overall like process of building the game up, as we said, like you've gone through various prototypes. Were there like any prototypes in the game that were either like more, I guess, I don't know if I want to say action oriented or like more tactical focus, or were there more that were more the slower side? Like, how did that go in terms of that kind of balance?
There weren't really, to some extent. We started from the beginning with the timeline, and so a lot of the iteration and experimentation was basically how do we it was a lot of like basically UI design, so like how do we get the timeline to convey all the information we want it to in a way that it does not, you don't need like a full page of text to like explain. And so over the course of it, it was a few things we made faster by like, okay, you can always have like a move action on right click, for example, like instead of, because at a very early point you selected move and then you select your destination, and I was like, okay, well, for just a one person thing, that's way too kind of overcomplicated. But no, it never really went out as far as like faster or slower. Like it was never like Diablo, for example, and then we like brought it back to where it is now. Or like, I mean, obviously XCOM was way slower, slower in a kind of like experiential sense. But so in that sense, from the prototype to timeline got much faster. But after that, no, it was really iterating on the actions that you would do, the types of levels. So like the interesting thing was we started out with our levels kind of like bigger, more open spaces, and with testing, and then like actually talking to like the people on the production, they came down to like way tighter, like thinner corridors. Like there is a maze in one level, but like kind of maze like environments, and there's a lot of figuring out the kind of engagement ranges of the AI that felt good. Like how many, like what was the balance of the AI? So like 2 people and 3 people felt right, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you mentioned playtesting, so I definitely want to touch on that in a minute. But going back to what you just said about getting like the feel of the commands down right, I gotta ask, did you ever play the game Door Kickers by any chance?
No, I have not. I'm not sure. I think I know the title sounds familiar, but I don't think I'm familiar with it at all.
It was kind of like a top-down, almost like old-school Rainbow Six or SWAT kind of game, where you're issuing like multiple commands to different units, and then you're watching it all play out. And the reason why I brought that game up was that a lot of people really enjoyed it for that, the level of granularity in terms of the amount of options you can do. You can approach a door slowly, you can run into it, you can do all these kinds of crazy things. And one of the things that kind of like pushed me away from it was just how slow it felt to be able to do some of these commands. And with someone like John Wick Hex, as you said, like for a normal tactical strategy gamer, left click to point, left click again to confirm, that's our bread and butter. But when you're trying to get something like this, especially getting in the hands of somebody who may not have played those games, all these like little shortcuts or speed ups, it feels like it's very important to like get them accustomed to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've had the breadth of responses is like, oh wow, I can't, it's a very slow action game. I'm not sure if I like this. And then we get people, real big strategy nerds that are like, oh wow, this feels great. I can move like as fast as I can click. And so it's been great being in between that. But yeah, it was definitely a consideration, and I think I'm kind of okay with that kind of spread, because to some extent, like if you know the times, the actions, the durations of the actions very well, and you kind of like glance at the timeline very quickly, like you can play extremely quickly, but there's absolutely no penalty at all for just letting the game pause, and it's like a true complete pause. It's not like infinitesimally moving forward. There's no penalty to just waiting around and taking as long as you want to. But yeah, it was a consideration for sure. And then everything else around that, as far as like the clicks in the interface, was all in service of kind of both getting out of the way of the player and showing them all the information we want them to see in, kind of digestible and quickly and all that sort of stuff. So it was, from our point of view, is much more about that, because once you have the information, you can play as fast or slow as you want from there.
Yeah. And speaking about that fast and slow, for people who are listening to us right now, you guys introduce another, or I'm not sure this would be considered a difficulty option or just a modifier, that you can set the game so that you only have 5 seconds to make an action, kind of like speed chess.
It is exactly. Yeah, it was pretty much that. Well, and we... it's not quite a difficulty mode. It is more of a modifier, but we did want to throw in something like a difficulty mode that wasn't just, more or fewer enemies or anything like that, because I mean, like production wise, it was very tight. So that kind of stuff takes time. And so this comparatively is relatively straightforward, but yeah, it's essentially, if you don't do something, in 5 seconds, the game will just auto wait for you. So you lose 0.2 seconds, like the world will advance 0.2 seconds if you don't do so. Yeah, the world will advance 0.2 seconds if you don't do something within the 5 seconds.
And I'm sure there are people out there who probably find that to be too slow as well.
Oh yeah, well, and like you can play it that quickly. So yeah, for sure, like it.
Yeah, and getting back to the topic about like play testing again, as you said, you got a very wide spectrum of responses and feedback on John Wick Hex. I guess one thing I really wanted to ask, in terms of like the overall, I guess, I'm not sure this would be the concept or the philosophy of the game, but in terms of where you want John Wick Hex to go, was this aimed to be kind of, again, like something for tactical strategy fans, something for people who've never touched the genre, or maybe somewhere in between the two?
Honestly, like for me personally, I wasn't really kind of considering a specific audience. So it was less about who it was going to be for, and more for me, like, can we do what we set out to do, which is, make an action movie with like this kind of logical underpinning to the world and that sort of thing, like a believability to the fights. Can we go from that to a like proper like tactics? I say proper, probably. I probably shouldn't say like proper in that way because it implies like an improper tactics game, but like a fully fleshed out tactics game that felt like it was doing the action thing like it was doing it not a disservice. So that was like, as far as the end point, that was my goal, and less about like an audience point of view.
Okay. And in terms of getting like feedback and balancing the game, were there earlier versions of the game that were harder in some area or aspect? Okay.
yeah. So obviously, like the feedback is definitely, it's been, we're only 2 days out from the release, but yeah, the feedback is it's quite hard, but it was at some point harder still. So, and then that kind of thing, for better or worse, is like a simple, us balancing it are a little bit too close to and a little bit too good at it, and have seen a little bit too much to be able to accurately judge how, especially like the front half of it, especially like the Chinatown tutorial map. I think that side of it is pretty well balanced, and then as you get to the later levels, it gets substantially harder. But to some extent, like we do want people to internalize the systems and the rules and the abilities in order to get through that. So it was not totally unintentional.
Okay. And speaking about, again, like the tools and what the player has to deal with, one thing that we didn't touch on yet that I think is a really good topic is the enemy design itself. Because again, in any kind of tactical strategy or any kind of strategy game, the enemy's tactics definitely infer on what you're able to do. For the people listening, obviously, like XCOM being a chief example, fighting a sectoid is monumentously different than fighting a muton or a chrysalid. And these things always have to be balanced with what the player's tool sets are. Now, from where I played, I think like when I stopped, I think I was nearing the end of the second chapter. So I saw, I think it was like the heavier security guard, the one that kind of like a machine gun or assault rifle. In terms of designing the enemies, what was kind of the overall concept you wanted to give them, or overall like design you wanted to put on them to kind of test the player?
So there's kind of two. The first division of the enemies is are they just melee or do they have a gun? And then within each of those, there are three kind of tiers. And so you saw the second tier, which is basically, or real quick, I guess first tier is like people would just have a pistol or revolver. Second tier is they have a rapid fire gun of some kind, and there's a few variations of that. And then the third tier, they have shotguns, basically. And then on the melee side of it, it's the strike, push, takedown. It goes like up from there. So initial enemies can just hit you. Everyone can just hit you. Then the middle tier, it's either push or takedown. I may have it flipped. But they can just push, and then the third tier can do the full like takedown maneuver, which for you can kill the first the early tier enemies in one hit. And so it was somewhat deliberate, or not somewhat. It was fairly deliberate to keep the like variability of the enemies kind of low, and partly is that because in a narrative sense, like there aren't like John Wick is fantastical in many ways, but ultimately it is just people. Like there's not aliens or fantasy stuff. Like people have swords and that sort of stuff occasionally, but as far as like for us, production budgets and that sort of thing, we're like, okay, we wanted to keep the actual set kind of low, but it becomes, and this is what I touched on at the very beginning, it becomes much more interesting on the combination of people attacking you. So if you enter a room and it's, one revolver guy, a tier 2 melee person, a tier 3 guy with a shotgun, and then a tier 2 gun guy with an assault rifle, that is a very different situation. Like with the sectoid and the muton thing, a very different situation to a room of just brawlers or just like tier 1 melee guys, or a room with all gun people. And even then, depending on when you enter the room, they could all be in a different point in their actions. They could all not be doing anything. They could all be shooting or moving and that sort of stuff. And so that's where we try and get a lot of the different encounters coming into play.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the actual, like, the enemy generation, the enemy spawning in, does the game kind of like tell, or does the game know like what tier of enemies to spawn, or like are the actual like higher tier enemies kind of fixed on the maps?
They are, if I understand you correctly, they are fixed. But each map kind of has a cadence to it, to who spawns and when. But you'll never see like a tier 3 guy show up in the first Chinatown maps kind of thing.
Okay.
It's not that dynamic, I suppose.
All right. And getting back to kind of like the pacing of the game, were there like earlier versions of the game that had like more, like, I guess to make things easier for people listening, like we have the levels and then broken down the sections. Were there earlier versions of the games that had like more or less sections? Or like how did you decide like how long you want an quote unquote level to be?
Not really, and it was it was more a situation where we kind of, it was a backwards way of doing it, where we're like, okay, we want about this many, there are 7 locations and about 5 to 6 levels within each one of those. Story wise, like those are kind of set by the story as written by Mike, and so we kind of knew like, all right, we knew it was gonna be 7 locations, and we knew we wanted about 5 to 6 within each, and so we just made that many, and then sort of worked out the pacing within each one and made sure it was doable, and obviously it's a little too difficult, but pacing wise we came from it backwards. It was less the other way around.
Okay. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else design related that I want to go over. I guess one thing about this, are there any aspects of the design of John Wick Hex that we didn't touch on yet that you'd like to bring up, Nick?
I think the only other thing is like we have, as far as talking about going from a squad to a single person, a big part of that was the focus system. And so focus just being a resource that you have, but it's not, I try to think of it as a bit more than just a resource. What you do spend it to do like the higher level take down and push melee moves, and it is taken away from you when you get hit, when you get shot, or you need damage. But it does a lot to like the hit chances. So if your hit chance is lower, or I'm sorry, if your focus is lower, your outgoing hit chance is lower, and likewise if it's high, incoming shot chances are decreased for enemies shooting you. It affects the stun times for actions and that sort of thing. So yeah, that was a big kind of iteration point to try and get that system to give like one extra dimension to the player and the enemies to feel get some more combinatorial effects coming out, for better or worse, I suppose.
Okay. And that actually reminds me of, in terms of the bosses themselves, like the bosses operate under kind of different rules compared to normal enemies. You can stun them, and a major part of it is that you have to engage in melee to break their focus to then finish them off with the gun itself. Yeah. So, what was kind of like the decision of coming up with how you wanted the bosses to play out?
So the bosses, the kind of goal of them, and I don't quite think we got to it, unfortunately. Like the goal was to recreate, some scenes from the movie where just John and one other person, because it's kind of two types of fight scenes. It's him going through just 6 or 8 or however many just dudes, and then it's like, okay, this is a cinematic character fight scene that blah 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 tells like a little story where they're just in one space playing out over this one environment. And the goal was to try to recreate those. And it ultimately became a challenge to not just dramatically increase their health and focus stats, and then to obviously, because like focus is not just a stat, you have to kind of give focus meaning. The higher up it goes, the more you have to kind of do with it. And so we ended up working out like, okay, so bosses being a bit more special, it's in some ways slightly more powerful than you, won't take health damage from melee attacks, and you can still shoot them when their focus is high, but their shot chance, or the chance to hit them while their focus is high, is really, really decreased. And so, that was basically the goal of it. But we ended up in where we were now because of just, I suppose it never got quite fleshed out enough underpinning. And it was more of like, how do we get the focus to work both in the way, like, trying to get focus to work for the player to have this like mental resource and mental like stat, and to work for the goons who have very little focus, but theoretically could lose it, and then also the bosses who we want to feel kind of like this power struggle.
And that's always been one of the hardest aspects of like strategy games in general, is trying to kind of have those quote unquote boss encounters. And it's always tough because, as we've said, like strategy games are built on an entirely abstracted design. And when you're dealing with abstract design, those are very hard rules in terms of play. Like in XCOM, for instance, I can't tell my squatty, go climb up that wall, jump over the rooftop, and do shooting while you're jumping from one rooftop to the next, because that's not an option that was planned in the game. And when you're trying to have a boss fight, you're trying to say, okay, we have this rigid set of rules. How do we make something higher on top of those set of rules? And
without making it like just obscenely hard, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
It was. I don't think we got there quite in the end, but I do think the bosses, I think, effectively force you to. Excuse me. I think the bosses effectively force you to change your tactics, because it's not the same as fighting a room full of regular guys. You do need to make the effort to close up on them, because one thing we do see is, I think, the evolution of people understanding the game is, you either start doing a lot of takedowns because they instant kill the first tier of enemies, or just shooting people all the time, and then you eventually evolve into like, oh, I have to preserve my ammunition because I have to be always picking up guns and getting myself correctly put in those positions to pick up guns. And then you get to the boss and you go, okay, now I have to know how to close up on the boss and do melee attacks on them consistently to then be able to deal out enough damage with a gun in order to actually kill them. So that's where we kind of ended up with, and it's not like I don't think it's definitely not the worst thing in the world, but it's not quite the movie scene, as I think we did better on with just like a regular goon fight or a group of goons.
Yeah. And like getting the player to that point, I think, is another very fascinating topic, as we talked about earlier with playtesting. And in terms of, I guess, like leading the player to like growing in this game, what were some like were there any like interesting challenges or bottlenecks you saw people run into with trying to learn the game?
That's that might be something I could answer better in like 6 months.
Okay.
After like stepping away from it and just watching people play after a long time. But yeah, we try. It was, I guess, from my point of view, we tried and we did a lot of work on the interface to get the information, especially on the timeline, to the player. But bottleneck wise, there was a couple little tweaks we made. Like when you're moving around and you see someone new for the first time, it'll interrupt your own move and basically pause the game time. Sorry, it'll pause the game time and show you the new person. And that was something that wasn't in a substantial amount of time. And we realized, like, right, people are making these very short little moves because, at any point in the fog of war, someone could just sprout out and, surprise you. And if you're in the middle of a very long move, they could turn and shoot you without you being able to do anything about it. So little things like that, what we ended up doing. But yeah, I think to some extent, we interface wise try and present all the information. Tutorials are not, the tutorialization is not perfect, but we do try and kind of convey a lot of the important concepts so that people can then get to like the next level of like, oh, right, I really should be conserving ammunition and that sort of thing. But I've definitely seen players that, especially before the tutorial, would just not pay attention to the timeline at all. Even though it takes up half the screen. Like, to me very personally, like, I have no idea how you wouldn't look at it, but that's how it is. That's just how some people are.
Okay. And it was definitely like tricky getting the game from the beginning. Like, all in my head as I was playing it, like the very first time I was saying, oh, this will be something like Superhot or Hotline Miami, something that is more like that kinetic, almost like that kind of like moment-to-moment rush of going from one enemy to the next. But when you sit down and play it, obviously it focuses a lot more on like you're planning the move out more in your head rather than you're improvising. And
yeah, we do. That I think comes down to an interpretation of the move. I'm sorry, not to say that I think you're wrong necessarily, but I've definitely seen people that are like, why isn't it faster? Or why isn't it, Hotline Miami or whatever? But I do think that comes down to an interpretation of the movies.
Yeah.
And to us, like, when we saw the movies, we see someone who is very skilled at their profession of killing people, but like you can see, you can kind of see the gears turning in his head, and you can see like deliberate motion, and like, sometimes he's waiting for someone to advance, sometimes he's moving forward or that sort of thing. And so we wanted to bring that like sense of thought to the player, and then just like what happens in a microsecond in the choreographed movie scene, we give you however much time you want. But yeah, people do start it and they definitely either expect like either kind of Diablo-ish or Hotline Miami or that sort of thing. But how long did it take you to go from that feeling to what it is in the end?
I think probably like around like getting to the second area. I think right around the time I beat the second boss was when I was starting to like get into the groove of things. But there is one aspect we didn't touch on yet that I was just thinking about. I think this is another fascinating point. Again, about kind of powering and depowering the player with John Wick, and that is the use of probability. for people who are listening, we have played many RNG heavy games on Game Wisdom and the YouTube channel. A lot of people probably found me from playing Darkest Dungeon. And that was a game that you live or die based on whether or not attacks could hit. And again, XCOM. People have seen me miss like 90 to 95% chance hits in that game, and
I have missed 98% and that sort of thing.
Welcome to the club there.
Oh, yeah.
And probability has always been one of those very tricky aspects of tactical strategy or strategy games in general, because as we've said, you're dealing with a very tightly bound set of rules. And when something can mess with or alter them, it can be seen as either, the angels are smiling on you or the game is just out to kill you.
Sure.
And
I mean, as far it was a big thing at the beginning of our production. So when we started, actually, there's a lot of ways I could tackle this, but like when we started production, I was just playing Into the Breach and BattleTech, which, as far as like design theory of probability, are like complete opposite ends of each other, right? And and I love both games. For me, are like practically immaculate. So when we started, I had a lot of draft ideas and a lot of notes trying to work out, like, okay, can we do this without probability? And the short answer is, because we just have one person, it's kind of just a no. Like, you really do, you do need to have a little bit of fuzziness on your actions, or the alternative was something like adding so many different like vectors of data, so that like whether something hit and did damage was like this 5-dimensional model, like that truly like may have been no randomness in it, but effectively presented as very hard to predict for the player. And so that kind of route didn't really feel appealing, also because I didn't have any ideas for what like this very like overly complex thing would be. And so the other direction of it was, narratively, in the movies, you see John miss, and so that kind of gave us a quick out if anyone asked, which I think you might be the first person that really asked. But it's like, well, you see him miss in the movies, so you made him miss in the game. But the way I see it, and from a designer's point of view, it's less, I have this beautiful system, but it's porous and it has these leaks in it, and the angels or the devils are smiling upon me, and more the BattleTech model of like, I will miss, I will get hit, it's not going to be a perfect run kind of game. And because you see that in the movies where at the end of the fight scenes, he's bloodied and bruised, and he's taking he's bandaged up, and he's got all you can see the wear and tear on him, that we wanted to say like, no, it's the probability is part of the it's part of the fabric of the world, and it's more of a game about like risk management. And it's like, because there are many situations of the game where you're like, well, I'm going to get shot, but it will be worth it to get 2 shots off on this guy so that I can proceed this third, or the second guy that's about to do this thing. But I'm going to get shot, and that's just what it's going to have to be right now. Another kind of low-key influence for me was Blood Bowl. Okay. And so very much on the risk management side of things, and very much like that for me, I do love Blood Bowl, but I don't think I enjoy it very much, because of the probability in the RNG is so part of it. But as far as like a game that's about spatial awareness and risk management and positioning, I think there, for me, are a lot of similarities between the two. So yeah, it started as like kind of a necessity because you only have one actor, and then it made a lot of narrative sense, and we wanted to kind of emotionally want it to be more about being bloodied and risk management and less the perfect run type of tactics game that I think even like to some extent, if you're playing XCOM, just let go of that perfect run idea because it's kind of truly more about the risk management thing. Where I think like Into the Breach is the perfect run model done quite well.
Yeah, and I'm very interested that you brought up Into the Breach because that's one of those games that I felt like a lot of people didn't really give that game a lot of deep analysis on. I know even I didn't do that as well. But it was such a very some people describe it as a strategy puzzle game in a weird way, and it just always worked differently, I think, compared to other strategy games, as you said, for the fact that there is no RNG in that game. But how things evolve is completely random over the course of each turn in a match.
Yeah, there's not RNG in the gamer presented side of it, but there is a fair amount. First you get those the buildings that have a chance to not be destroyed, but the movement, the real actual randomness in the game is the movement of the enemies, and so it's slightly not true to say that there's no in it, but compared to a Blood Bowl or a BattleTech where there are percentage numbers in every corner of the screen, it's a different philosophy.
Yeah.
And for us, we also looked at it and said, and we really liked the how would you say, projecting or seeing into the future a little bit of seeing what all the enemies are going to do on their next turn, so you can anticipate them, and that led into John Wick quite a bit.
Yeah. And there's two other games I just wanted to bring. I just want to get your thoughts on them, and then I think I am just about out of questions. But I really wanted to ask, were you at all inspired by games like Invisible Ink or Metal Gear Acid? Because
definitely Invisible Ink, if only because I've not played Metal Gear Acid. But Invisible Ink. Well, I really like it. I think it's very, very good. It does a lot of things. A big deal touching off on Invisible Ink was we did not, and this I think definitely plays into the XCOM comparisons. We did not want to make a stealth tactics thing. And obviously XCOM is kind of half a stealth tactics, half a action regular tactics, and Invisible Ink is almost all stealth tactics. But for us, it wasn't it's not a big part of the movies. It's 10-15% of the fights are he's a little bit stealthy, and then once it's off, it's all back off. There's no returning to that point, and so that's kind of where we're at in the game. There's a few instances where you can get the drop on someone. Invisible Ink was a touchstone, but not quite as much as you would think, if only because a lot of their decisions and the design is in service of a stealth setup and always returning to stealth. Where for us it was okay, we don't want to show, we thought about a noise system for a time, but then if you have noise, then people don't want to make noise. And so we kind of got rid of the noise because we don't want to encourage stealth play, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and Invisible Ink, again, is another very fascinating. We could easily just turn this cast and just let's talk about our favorite, off-brand tactical strategy games in that regard. And as you're saying, that kind of balance between stealth and action is always very difficult to go by. And again, kind of gets back to the heart of something like John Wick Hex, in that how powerful should the player be?
Yeah, and one thing is we did not want that power to include being stealthy. Basically, is the short answer. Because it's not really part of the movies, and it's not really. And I say part of the movies, it's not the focus of the movies, and so we really didn't want to be the focus of what we were doing.
All right. I think with that, we are just over an hour, and we could easily segue into other topics, but I think we've hit on just about everything that has to do with John Wick Hex. I guess, for you, any other topics that we didn't touch on?
No, I don't think so. I think it was a lot of we got a lot of the design thoughts and that sort of thing, the evolutions of it.
Okay. All right. In that case, I just have a few wrap-up questions for you, Nick, and then I will let you go for the evening.
Sure.
So, I guess the first one is, so right now, John Wick Hex, I know it's available on Epic Games, and what other platforms is it going to be available on?
At the moment, it will. We're not saying. What are we saying? Just consoles in the future.
Okay.
I don't think I even know, to be honest, which ones. But yes, at the moment, PC and Mac on the Epic Games Store, and then consoles in the future.
Okay. And what is, can you, for the fans listening, can you give us any tease about what's coming next from Bithell Games?
I cannot. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's still. I mean, obviously, it's still very early for us. But yeah, we've got things we'll be doing. But yeah, there's nothing really to show, unfortunately, or talk about. I mean.
All right. And I guess my final question, and this is one I don't think you're going to have the right answer for, but is there any way you can get Keanu Reeves on, like, for one of these casts for me? Like, can I talk to him about video games?
I'm sorry, I just got off the phone with him, so I can't really pull that card twice. I'm sorry.
Well, folks, I try. For those of you listening right now, so I guess my final question for you, Nick, then is for the fans or anybody listening, do you have anything you want to say to the people who've been enjoying the game, or something to wrap the cast up with?
I guess just thank you. Honestly, I'm really happy that people enjoy it and and get a lot of fun out of it. So yeah, thank you very much.
All right, great. So with that said, for everybody listening, we're going to end the cast here. Thank you so much for tuning in, whether you're watching this on the Game Wisdom site, YouTube channel, or anywhere else. If you want to follow me, you can follow me on Twitter at GWBicer. We have our Discord channel. It should be linked somewhere around where you're listening to. And for you, Nick, do you have any social media you would like to plug right now?
Yeah, if you just want to find me on Twitter, it's Nic Tringali. It's NICTRINGALI.
All right. And I think with that, we are about done. So once again, folks, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to support Game Wisdom, we have the Patreon, patreon.com/GWBicer. And come back for our daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And last but not least, if you are a developer working on an upcoming or recent release game and want to talk about it or design, definitely feel free to get in touch. But otherwise, that's going to do it for this week's cast. And be sure to check out my first look video on John Wick Hex, which should be out probably before this cast goes up. So thanks again for tuning in, and I will see you next time for another discussion on game design.